Today, we are exploring the therapy container, the holding environment, and emotional attunement. I'm Brooke, and welcome to If Your Therapist Knew, where research meets relationship, a podcast exploring the relational foundations of psychotherapy through the lenses of attachment theory, trauma-informed care, person-centered psychology, and psychotherapy research. My hope is to bridge the gap between clinical language and lived reality, to explore not only what therapy is supposed to do, but how healing actually happens between people in a room. If Your Therapist Knew explores the often unspoken aspects of the client experience that shape whether therapy feels safe, connecting, and truly healing. Have you ever experienced an emotion that felt so overwhelming, so chaotic, or so painful that it seemed impossible to hold by yourself? Not just sadness or stress, but something that felt physically consuming, the kind of emotional experience that lives in your chest, your stomach, your throat, the kind of feeling that makes it hard to think clearly, speak clearly, or even stay connected to yourself. For many people, especially those with histories of trauma, emotional neglect, chronic invalidation, or inconsistent caregiving, this is not an occasional experience. It becomes a baseline way of living. And this is important because when we talk about emotional regulation, we often talk about it as though it is purely an individual skill. We tell people to calm down, self-soothe, use coping skills, journal, breathe, or think differently. But interpersonal neurobiology, attachment theory, and psychodynamic theory all point us towards something much deeper. Human beings were never designed to regulate entirely alone. Our nervous systems are profoundly relational. From the beginning of life, emotion becomes tolerable through relationship. A baby cannot regulate overwhelming distress alone. A child learns emotional regulation through repeated experiences of being soothed, understood, and emotionally held by another person. And when those early experiences are inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, frightening, dismissive, or unpredictable, the developing nervous system adapts. Some people learn to shut emotions down entirely. Some people become hypervigilant to rejection or abandonment. Some become chronically overwhelmed by feelings they cannot organize internally. And many people enter adulthood believing that their emotional intensity means something is fundamentally wrong with them. But attachment theorists and trauma researchers increasingly frame these patterns differently. These are not defects, they are survival adaptations. The nervous system organizes itself around whatever environment it develops within, and this is one of the deepest functions of therapy. At its best, therapy becomes a relationship where overwhelming emotional experiences can finally become tolerable enough to feel, organize, understand, and integrate. Not because the therapist removes pain, but because the therapist helps the client carry what once felt unbearable. This is where we begin exploring emotional attunement, holding, containment, and the therapy container. And at the center of all of these ideas is one organizing principle. The therapist metabolizes what the client cannot yet regulate alone. To understand where these ideas come from, we have to begin with British pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. Winnicott fundamentally changed how psychology understood emotional development. He introduced the concept of the holding environment. When a child becomes distressed, overwhelmed, frightened, or dysregulated, the caregiver responds through voice, facial expression, touch, rhythm, consistency, and emotional presence. Over thousands of moments, the child slowly internalizes a profound nervous system expectation. When I become overwhelmed, I do not disappear alone. Someone helps me survive the experience. The good enough caregiver responds reliably enough that the child develops continuity, safety, and trust while still learning to tolerate small amounts of distress. This is where emotional regulation begins, not inside the isolated self, inside relationship. Winnicott's own life heavily influenced these ideas. He reportedly grew up surrounded by multiple maternal figures, including sisters, caretakers, household staff, while his mother struggled emotionally. He later became known for his unusually warm, nurturing, emotionally attuned clinical presence. What fascinated him was not simply trauma itself, but what happens when emotional continuity breaks, when emotional holding disappears, when a child has no consistent place to emotionally land. Without adequate holding, emotions can begin to feel catastrophic. Small disappointments become experiences of abandonment. Conflict and shame become unbearable. The self begins organizing around emotional defense instead of emotional safety. And this is why therapy often becomes far more emotionally significant than many people initially expect. Because for some clients, the therapy relationship may become the first experience of consistent emotional holding they have ever known. This is also why continuity matters so deeply in therapy. The consistency of the therapist, the repeated appointment time, the predictability of the room, the therapist remembering what matters, the emotional steadiness across sessions. These things may seem small externally, but psychologically and neurobiologically, they become profoundly regulating. The therapy container begins forming long before insight occurs. Sometimes healing begins with the nervous system slowly realizing this relationship continues existing even when I am distressed. Donald Winnicott would say that the holding environment is neither just the physical office nor just the therapist as a person, but rather an integration of physical, relational, and structural elements that create a secure psychological space. Winnicott's concept emphasizes the therapist providing love, support, stability, and continuity of being. The holding environment relies heavily on the predictability and consistency of the professional arrangement, often referred to as the frame. The sources describe the holding environment as the scaffolding around a building under construction. It takes the physical weight and protects the structure until the client's internal walls are strong enough to stand on their own. The ultimate goal of this environment is for the client to internalize the container so they can eventually become their own holding environment. While Winnicott focused on the emotional environment itself, psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion focused on something more active. What exactly is the therapist doing internally while emotionally holding another person? Bion introduced one of the most important ideas in psychodynamic psychotherapy: containment. If Winnicott gave us the holding environment, Bion explained the emotional metabolism occurring inside it. Bion believed that human beings sometimes experience emotions that are too overwhelming to mentally process. He called these raw, overwhelming emotional experiences beta elements. Beta elements are emotions and sensations that have not yet become organized enough to think about. They are felt before they can be spoken. A crushing sensation in the chest, panic without words, rage without understanding, terror that exists purely as bodily overwhelm. For traumatized individuals especially, these experiences may feel impossible to organize internally. And when emotions cannot be mentally processed, they are often discharged behaviorally or relationally. People may dissociate, explode, shut down, withdraw, project, become flooded, or unconsciously transfer unbearable emotional states into the people around them. Bion described the therapist as functioning psychologically like a container. The therapist receives these overwhelming emotional experiences without retaliating, collapsing, abandoning, shaming, or becoming overwhelmed themselves. And this is crucial. The therapist does not simply hear the emotion intellectually. The therapist feels it. The despair, the panic, the helplessness, the shame, the terror, the rage, but instead of reacting defensively, the therapist mentally processes the experience. Bion called this the alpha function. The therapist metabolizes emotionally overwhelming experience, and gradually returns it to the client in a more organized, understandable, and tolerable form. This is why many clients experience relief in therapy before receiving any advice, because the unbearable emotion has finally become shareable, thinkable, containable. A client may enter therapy feeling emotionally fragmented and leave feeling more organized internally, even if nothing externally has changed yet. This is relational emotional processing, and importantly, the therapist does not rush this process. One of the most sophisticated therapeutic skills is the ability to remain emotionally present without prematurely explaining, fixing, interpreting, reassuring, or intellectualizing. Sometimes the therapist's greatest contribution is their capacity to survive the emotional intensity without abandoning the client emotionally. To communicate to the client, I can stay here with this. You don't have to carry this alone. And eventually, through repetition, clients slowly internalize this process themselves. They begin developing the capacity to observe emotion rather than becoming consumed by it. This is where reflective functioning begins emerging. Instead of, I'm in panic, the client slowly develops the ability to say, I'm noticing panic arising inside of me. That shift changes everything. For many years, concepts like holding and containment were viewed largely as psychoanalytic metaphors, but modern interpersonal neurobiology has increasingly demonstrated that these processes are deeply biological. Alan Shore, Daniel Siegel, Stephen Porges, and other researchers have helped explain how emotional attunement actually occurs between nervous systems. One of Alan Shore's central ideas is that the deepest forms of emotional communication occur through right brain to right brain communication. The right hemisphere of the brain is dominant for emotion, attachment, facial expression, nonverbal communication, bodily states, and relational processing. Long before children develop sophisticated language, they are learning emotional regulation through facial expression, eye contact, tone of voice, rhythm, timing, and nervous system synchrony. And importantly, this process does not disappear in adulthood. Therapy is happening non-verbally all the time. Clients are constantly detecting cues of safety or danger beneath conscious awareness. The therapist's posture, voice, pace, facial responsiveness, eye contact, emotional steadiness, their ability to remain grounded. This is why emotional attunement is not simply agreeing with someone or being nice. Attunement means accurately recognizing, responding to, and emotionally tracking another person's internal state. And clients often know when attunement breaks. Even subtle shifts matter. A therapist becoming emotionally distant, a flat facial expression, a distracted tone, a rushed response, a mismatch in emotional timing. For clients with histories of emotional neglect or relational trauma, these moments can feel enormous because the nervous system is not merely listening to words. It is scanning for relational safety. This connects closely to the concept of the window of tolerance. The window of tolerance refers to the zone where a person can remain emotionally activated while still staying regulated enough to think, feel, reflect, and remain connected. When emotional intensity exceeds that window, people may move into hyperarousal. So this could be panic, rage, hypervigilance, fight or flight activation, or they may move into hypoarousal, which might be numbing, shutdown, dissociation, or collapse. One of the therapist's most important functions is helping clients remain within or near this window while processing difficult experiences, not eliminating emotion or avoiding activation, but helping emotion become tolerable enough to stay present with. This is co-regulation. The therapist's regulated nervous system becomes an anchor. And over time, repeated experiences of co-regulation gradually become internalized. Clients begin developing their own capacity for self-regulation. In many ways, therapy becomes a nervous system experience before it becomes an intellectual one. Often, clients heal not simply because of what was said, but because of how consistently it felt to be emotionally held. Attachment theory gives us another powerful framework for understanding the therapy relationship. John Bowlby described attachment as an inborn motivational system organized around safety, connection, and protection. When children experience distress, they instinctively move toward attachment figures. And healthy attachment relationships serve two essential functions. The first is the secure base. The secure base supports exploration. It allows the therapy client to move outward into difficult emotional territory while trusting that the relationship remains stable. The second is the safe haven. The safe haven is the place the person emotionally returns to when overwhelmed. This becomes incredibly important in therapy. Because therapy asks clients to approach emotions, memories, fears, grief, shame, and relational pain they may have spent years avoiding. That kind of emotional exploration only becomes possible when enough safety exists. And importantly, attachment theory increasingly reframes insecure attachment patterns not as pathology, but as adaptation. Avoidance often develops because closeness once felt emotionally unsafe. Anxiety may develop because connection once felt unpredictable. Hypervigilance may develop because attunement was inconsistent. The nervous system adapts intelligently to relational environments, which means healing also happens relationally. The therapy relationship becomes a place where new emotional experiences slowly challenge old internal working models. And one of the most powerful parts of this process is rupture and repair. Many people unconsciously assume healthy relationships never involved conflict, misunderstanding, disappointment, or emotional disconnection. But attachment research shows something different. Security is not created by perfection. It is created through reliable repair. The client feels misunderstood. The therapist misses something. A session feels disconnected. The client withdraws. The therapist notices. The rupture becomes acknowledged, and then something new happens. The relationship survives. For many clients, this becomes profoundly corrective, especially for those whose earlier relationships ended in abandonment, punishment, shame, or emotional withdrawal. Repair teaches the nervous system conflict does not automatically equal disconnection, and over time, repeated experiences of rupture and repair expand the client's capacity for emotional intimacy, trust, and relational resilience. One of the long-term goals of psychotherapy is helping clients develop reflective functioning. Reflective functioning refers to the ability to think about emotional experience rather than simply react from within it. It involves recognizing that feelings, thoughts, bodily states, and behaviors all carry meaning. And importantly, reflective functioning develops relationally. People learn to understand themselves more deeply by first being understood by another person. This is why emotionally attuned therapy often changes people beyond symptom reduction. Clients begin noticing internal states earlier. They recognize patterns, they identify triggers, they develop language for emotional experience. They begin tolerating feelings that once felt unbearable. They become less reactive, more integrated, and more emotionally flexible. Daniel Siegel often describes mental health as integration. Integration involves linking previously disconnected systems, so emotion and cognition, body and mind, past and present, self and relationship. Trauma often creates fragmentation. Emotions become disconnected from awareness. The body becomes disconnected from safety. The self becomes divided around survival strategies. Therapy gradually reconnects these systems, and this process happens slowly, not through insight alone, but through repeated experiences of emotional safety, attunement, reflection, and co-regulation. Eventually, clients begin carrying a new internal experience of themselves. Not as broken, not as too much, not as fundamentally unsafe, but as emotionally understandable and human and worthy of care, and capable of surviving emotional experience without fragmentation. Over time, one of the most profound shifts in therapy begins occurring quietly. The client slowly internalizes the therapist's regulating presence. At first, emotional regulation largely depends on the therapy relationship itself. The client borrows the therapist's steadiness. The therapist helps organize overwhelming emotional experience. The therapist becomes the external container. But gradually, something begins changing. Clients start hearing the therapist's voice internally, not literally, but psychologically. A more reflective voice begins emerging, a calmer, more compassionate voice, a less shaming voice. The client begins pausing before spiraling. They begin recognizing their own emotional states earlier. They begin offering themselves the same curiosity, gentleness, and emotional holding they once only experienced inside therapy. This is the deeper goal of the therapeutic container, not dependency, but internalization. The client gradually becomes capable of creating safety within themselves. Winnicott described healthy development as moving from dependence toward greater independence, not through isolation, but through the internalization of reliable emotional experience. The external holding environment slowly becomes an internal holding environment. And perhaps this is one of the deepest truths at the center of psychotherapy. Healing often begins when another person helps us survive emotional experiences we once believed would destroy us. And through enough experiences of emotional attunement, co-regulation, rupture and repair, and relational safety, the nervous system slowly learns something new. Emotion can be survived, connection can remain intact, and the self does not disappear in the presence of pain. For therapists, counseling students, and clients alike, this changes how we understand healing. Therapy is not simply the exchange of insight. It's not only problem solving or just merely a technique. At its core, therapy is a deeply relational process where overwhelming emotional experience becomes tolerable through connection. The therapist metabolizes what the client cannot yet regulate alone, and eventually, the client develops the capacity to do this for themselves. This is the heart of emotional holding. This is the function of the therapy container. And that is how relationship becomes a mechanism of transformation. Thank you for joining me for this episode of If Your Therapist Knew. Take care of yourselves this week, and remember, even when an emotion feels impossible to carry alone, healing often begins when it is finally held safely in relationship.